Well, hello everyone. I would like to make a few comments about this module in Theories of Text and Technology. It's the module on interactivity, engagement, and users. And we have a bunch of readings, and as you know, there is a web page in Canvas for this module as well, which I would like you to take a look at. And so what I want to do is just run through basically some of what's in here, and I look forward to what your comments would be in the discussion area on this, because I know a lot of you have some significant experience on some of these sorts of issues, and so having the experience of people who have actually worked in industry or studied this in more depth would be really quite useful, I think. So there are a few kinds of issues that I think are central or important to this notion of interactivity. And some of it is going to be attached or connected to what we talked about a couple of weeks ago in connection with the idea of the interface, right? I mean, these might seem to come together as issues, and in some ways, I guess they do. But interactivity just seems to be a broader and a fuzzier sort of notion, and I think we see that reflected in a lot of the readings that we have, especially in the Gain and Beer book. Their chapter on interactivity really starts off by saying, this gets used for all sorts of things and probably too broadly, at times. And if you think about it for a second, that does make a certain amount of sense. I mean, we intuitively think about interactivity in terms of a relationship between digital technology and humans, and we think about it as distinct from older forms of engagement with technology. So take television, for example. We normally think of television as not interactive. Why? Because it delivers us a message in one direction, but we don't control anything or respond in any significant way. Even if we have something like a Nielsen box on top of the television, which measures the engagement of viewers with particular channels or programs or whatever, we wouldn't really consider that interactivity either, even though some information is flowing the other direction. It's minimal information, and it's not information that is meant to control anything. Furthermore, if we have, let's say, a remote control with our television, there is some level of interactivity there, in as much as we can move around apps, if we have a streaming box of some sort, like Amazon Fire or whatever. We can change channels within an app. If it's has multiple channels, like a DirecTV or whatever, we can change channels in live TV streams, or digital TV streams, whatever. All of that seems to be a pretty minimal level of interactivity, right? I mean, pretty basic level, because all we're doing really is choosing from a set of existing options. We're not really altering those options in any significant way. We might broaden it. We might say, okay, maybe interactivity is not just about humans interacting with technology. Maybe it's about anything interacting with anything. And so if we broaden it that far, now we are, including humans interacting with humans. You would usually call that conversation or dialogue or something like that. And there certainly is a certain sense of engagement. If I'm truly listening to you, that should affect what I'm thinking, how I respond, maybe, my facial expressions, my bodily, position, my posture, whatever. Presumably we are interacting and affecting each other in that interaction. I mean, if I just kind of stand there with no affect, I don't know if you've ever known people like this. I've known a few people that have very, very little affect. You talk to them and you can't actually tell, what they're thinking. There's no smile, there's no, I don't agree, or, there's nothing, right? And so, talking to them feels like talking to a wall. So we intuitively know what it is like to not get a kind of message back when we are putting a message out, as it were. That feels like broadening the notion of interactivity too far, but maybe it's still instructive, right? I mean, maybe when we're thinking about interactivity, that's what we're thinking of. We're thinking of something where, we can read the other person, the technology, the media, whatever. We can read it in a certain way, and it can read us. And we're not at that point yet. Right? I mean, we're just not at that point where there's that level of reading, the same kind of level of reading that we have in real conversation with each other. So, we might think that something like a Zoom call is simply interactivity between people mediated by technology. And that would certainly be that, I would say. I think there is, that mediation provides some, some affordances. It allows certain things to happen. It also prohibits other kinds of things from happening. So if I'm on a Zoom call with you, we can hear each other, we can see each other to an extent, right? You can see my head like you can now in this video. But not much more. You can't see if I'm kind of, maybe you can see if I'm leaning back like this or something, but, there's a lot you can't see, plus there's a lot you can't hear because of the bandwidth, and any of the other senses really aren't present either. So, it really does kind of shape what kind of interactivity we can have. Having said that, it is interactivity on a technological platform. So maybe we need to include that in a form of interactivity where humans are engaging with other humans. We could look on chat boards, social media, all sorts of things where humans engage with other humans, using a technological platform. And we could talk about the affordances and the disaffordances of that kind of activity. But usually when we talk about, interactivity, we have in mind this notion of humans interacting with a piece of technology. And so figuring out just what that means and what it involves, I think, is kind of important. So let's go over to the module here, and you can see what the readings are for this. Most of them are from the major textbook, the New Media Reader. We do have a couple of other things here as well. We have, of course, the Gain and Beer reading, and we have J.J. Gibson and his theory of affordances, which has already come up in other ways, but we're going to talk maybe a little bit more about it. And then Brian Masumi, who talks about activist philosophy and the occurrent arts. And so in a sense, I include these, and if you look at the top here where I talk about the theories that are involved here, I talk about pragmatism and activism as scholarship. And the reason I do that is that I think that's a kind of implication of interactivity, right? If we are to be interactive, it's not just about control structures. It's not just about us being able to control the feed of the media that we want. It seems to me that it spills out from there. It goes further than that. And, interactivity in a certain sense is also about a community. It's also about social groups, social organizations, and so I think activism is an interesting thing to bring up in this context, right? If we are being given agency through interactivity, is it just agency over our technology? Or is it agency further than that? Is it, do we have the freedom to create the world that we want to be in? Firstly, in the technological or media sense, and then secondly, in the real world sense. And to what extent does technology engage with that kind of thing? Another of the previous modules that I think this links to is the discussions that we had earlier about networks. I mean, one way to think about networks is not just as forms of communication between technology, but forms of interchange of information that involve humans, right? And so I guess the question then is, what kind of form of, if you wish, interactivity or network is appropriate for particular kinds of things. In some cases, for example, the interactivity is one that is very hierarchical. So you could think of, let's say, a military structure, a military hierarchy. So you have, the highest ranking officers on top, all the way down to the lowest ranking officers on the bottom. And why is it structured like this? Well, in part, it's because there's a desire for efficiency of operation and a quickness of response, right? So if somebody gives an order, everyone is very well trained to quickly follow those orders. There's no discussion. You're supposed to simply follow what you're told and do it because somebody else has figured out this is the right thing to do. So that has its benefits, right? I mean, for speed of response and for being able to have a kind of cohesive unit and all of that sort of thing. That kind of hierarchy makes a lot of sense for a specific set of purposes. Do we want to model all of society on that model? I think probably not. I think there are a lot of other ways that we have of engaging each other that are not so much about efficiency or not so much about quickness of response, but about deliberation, right? And so, maybe we want the messiness of an interchange, technologically mediated or otherwise, in order to kind of bring our values to the surface, in order to make sense out of the world. Maybe there is no single person that we can trust at the top that can just give orders and we'll all follow it and everything's fine. Maybe, in fact, that can be a dangerous model under some circumstances when the person at the top is giving orders that are problematic or destructive. And so, I think there are a number of models of interactivity that we could think about that are kind of connected to the models of networks that we talked about, during that module. You remember we had different kind of topologies of networks. And I think that comes home to roost here. Do we want a form of interactivity that is an exchange, one-to-one exchange of everyone to everyone at the same time? In some ways that's a very, that's a very good thing because you're not mediated by anyone else. Nobody's interpreting what you're saying to something else. But on the other hand, it's extremely expensive and extremely, sometimes very inefficient. So, that's why there's so many kind of topologies of networks, and that's why there's so much discussion about how exchanges take place. So as we look through this, I've got a kind of discussion that kind of gets us started here on interactivity that that brings up some of the points that I've already talked about here. Some of it is in the context of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which I find to be a really kind of interesting pop culture sort of window onto some of these things, and that's where I bring up some of these network notions. I think it also brings up some notions around I guess we call it agency. I mean, what interactivity is supposed to offer us is human agency. In other words, the ability to do something, the ability to freely do something, right? And yet it also offers the potential for us being limited in a certain sense. I mean, interactivity runs both directions. And so we might, see ourselves as just as much controlled in an interactive relationship as we are controlling. And so, so interactivity has that kind of dual edge to it, I think. So as we get into the Gain and Beer reading, we can, as I mentioned already, we can see Gain and Beer, kind of acknowledging the kind of complex sort of nature of interactivity and kind of working through, especially McLuhan and Levmanovich, on some of this. And, coming to the end and thinking in terms of the kind of social structures that kind of emerge around interactivity. We could think about, social structures in terms of economic or political structures as well. I mean, feels like a long way away from what we sometimes think of as interactivity with technology, but I think these questions are all relevant. I think the question of whether we model interactivity on a notion of exchange, like a marketplace exchange, let's say, or on the notion of, let's say, coming together in an agora or in a kind of public forum in order to decide on things. I mean, this leaves us with very different kinds of interactivity between those two kinds of models. And there are probably other models that we could point to as well. And so, when we think about interactivity, I think that's one of the things we have to think about. What is the kind of theoretical foundation? Is it simply one of control, that is given to us, or that seems to be given to us when we can kind of have input into the activity or actions of that technology? Do we really have control? Maybe we don't. Maybe all options lead us to where the maker of the technology wants us to go, which is maybe to their gift shop. It reminds me of going through art museums, and you always exit through the gift shop. Well, no matter what path you take through the art museum, you're going out through the gift shop. And so, maybe there is a certain sense that there is an illusion of control in interactivity, but not really the reality of it. Maybe the control needs to come at a different level entirely. And, we could talk about, things like, modding games, for example, which is a whole other level of control. I mean, we could talk about interactivity in games, where a player does something, and then there are certain consequences that appear in the game itself. But, that is, that's within the game, and if you mod the game in a certain way, maybe there are other kinds of actions that appear that make themselves apparent. Just because the kind of visual or social sphere has changed. So so that's the gain and beer. I think get into some of those ambiguities around interactivity. One of the early examples, and we've talked about this before, is Joseph Weizenbaum's ELIZA. I've got a link in the module here to the original code. You can go and take a look at it. And of course, we have the article in the book as well. In a certain sense, that's a kind of illusion of interactivity, right? I mean, there's a relatively small number of lines of code in ELIZA, but people read it as responding to them, right? And as their input mattering to the kind of response they were going to get. And so it felt interactive, even if it was a very limited form of interactivity in reality. And so that kind of raises interesting questions as well. I mean, what is true interactivity versus a kind of controlled set of responses? We might get that, that question might appear for us if we're, on a chatbot on some corporation's site, we're trying to buy something and we're asking it questions, and maybe the AI is only so good and it can't really answer the questions that we want to ask. That happens to me all the time, actually. If I have a question about something, it's usually not a question that the chatbot is prepared to answer. Because what the chatbot knows is, the technical specifications and the marketing copy and all of those sorts of things, but it doesn't know much beyond that. So, it can't really understand, uses for something that fall outside of, what's already been prescribed. So that question of what interactivity actually is, I think, is a significant one. We've got the Myron Kruger piece, and I've got some videos for a bunch of these things, so I'd encourage you to take a look at some of them. A lot of them are, pretty, short videos, but some of them are videos from, quite a long time ago, and so I think illustrate what the authors were actually thinking about. And so the Kruger piece is kind of fun about responsive environments, to think about, what it actually looks like to operate digitally within something like that. And he's thinking about it in terms of art, but it's a lot more than that as well. The Alan Key and Adele Goldberg piece, Personal Dynamic Media, is got a couple of videos here, and I think these are really great videos because in a certain sense what they're talking about is something that, decades later we actually see in reality. They're prefiguring laptops and tablets with what they imagine, and their imagination of these sorts of things are basically children's computers. How do we interact with children? Well, it turns out that the way they're imagining interacting with children is the way that many of us actually want to interact with a computer now. So they're imagining a certain level of interactivity or a certain form of interactivity that cognitively they imagine it as being a kind of basic level, a child's level, and yet that turns out to be something that we found or we still find useful. Sherry Turkle, there's lots of Sherry Turkle stuff online. And, you probably know about Sherry Turkle. She is, somebody who was well known for kind of working with video games early on and had kind of turned towards a more skeptical position about networked digital technology. Felt, like we were, as she put it in one book, alone together, that it was standing in the way of real human relationships. And so, in a certain sense, she comes to the position of thinking that the interactivity is actually harmed by computer engagement. Now, there's a lot of discussion about this, including in our own program. I mean, some people would agree with her. I think a lot of people probably wouldn't agree with her. And so I'm not, showing you this to, take one side or the other on this case, but I do think she raises important questions around the, if you wish, downside of interactivity. Does it prevent human interaction, or does it simply afford better human interaction, or does it do both of these things under different conditions? So, it's an interesting thing to think about. The video I've given you of her here is done before the age of large language model AI. And so it's interesting to think about all of this in the context of AIs today. Is it just worse, basically? Finally, there's another article that is just about the teleinformation system. Kind of a historical article that really, in some ways, prefigures some of the things we see later. And really is about how humans can be interactive on these on digital space. Lucy Suckman takes on questions around whether AI needs to be embodied or not to be truly intelligent. Suckman is an artist as well as an AI person, and she's interested in what we might think of as embodied cognition, which we have already talked about in various contexts. So she raises the question of whether interactivity really does require a kind of material engagement, a material connection of some sort. We have some level of it, obviously. I mean, I'm talking to you on a video right now, and there is not interactivity because, the only way you're going to be talking back is in the discussion area for the course. But, there is a level of communication going on. Lucy Suckman wants to raise the question of what part embodiment plays in all of this. We've talked about Gibson before, J.J. Gibson, and I think the important thing for Gibson, this notion of affordance, is about a kind of direct engagement we have with the world. That's what he was interested in talking about. And so, interactivity in a certain sense is he would want to see that as direct, not mediated. And what an affordance is our recognition of what the world makes possible for us and what it does not make possible for us. So his examples tend to be things like, if you walk into a room, you recognize the kinds of things that afford sitting, that are good for sitting on, and the things that don't afford sitting. So there's a chair here, you don't even think about it. You perceive it directly, you sit on it. Other things, it doesn't even occur to you that it might be a good thing to sit on, right? Unless the circumstances are unusual. Maybe there's nothing else in the room to sit on. Maybe you're trying to make some sort of point, and so you're going to sit on a desk or sit on a whatever, or maybe you're trying to be more casual. I mean, there's lots of reasons why you might sit on something that does not obviously afford sitting. But for the most part, Gibson is trying to make the claim that we have a kind of direct perception, and it's almost a bodily perception about how to engage the world. And so we interact, if you wish, with the world, given that kind of, I mean, you might think of it as evolutionary, you might think of it as simply learned in some way, but we engage the world at a level that's below a kind of conscious cognitive level. And so I guess when it comes to technology, the question then is, well, how can we afford things? In other words, what does it mean to have affordances? And we've seen some of the answers to that already through people like Don Norman, who have talked about the ways in which we engage our technology, spatially and visually and all sorts of other ways. We have certain expectations about what certain kind of buttons are and what they're not. And so there's, lots of ways that we can at least simulate affordances in that space. Gibson's notion very much is a kind of material, he's one of the fathers of environmental psychology. So he's interested in the ways that we engage the environment. Don Norman gives us, a version that is much more amenable to our technology. And so someone like Brian Masumi stretches us even a little bit further on notions of interactivity. I mean, his article on activist philosophy in the occurrent arts is really about the ways that we imagine engaging with the world. And he ultimately calls what he has in mind the technology of lived abstraction. So as I say here in this piece, he's trying to get us to think about the recognition that the world is not how we want it and the imagination of a new world in a kind of interactive relationship. He sees philosophy as an experimental practice, and so a kind of wayfinding in the world. And so there is a back and forth, there is an engagement with the world and a way that we act in that world. And that can easily involve technology. But the question is always about what kind of world do we want? What kind of world are we striving for? Or are we just kind of rolling along with the world as it is? So I've got some more videos here that I think are interesting on interactivity. There's a video on Twine here. Some of you know about Twine already, and so that's worth taking a look at. I've got some videos also on users and usability testing, which I think are really useful and interesting in this context. I mean, usability really is about interactivity, right? I mean, we're trying to streamline this notion of how we interact. And cybersecurity is another element of interactivity as well. I've got this video on the difference between pen testing and red teaming. Pen testing or penetration testing is the attempt to test the structural and code of a system in order to find vulnerabilities. Red teaming is using whatever kind of social engineering or whatever you can to kind of crack into a system. So that would involve even going into a workplace and seeing if people have their passwords post-it noted on their cubicles or something like that, or getting entry and access in any of those other ways that don't involve finding the problems in a system. And so interactivity again, because in a certain sense there are high walls up with systems that are meant to only admit certain people and not other people. But this is a certain kind of usability or bad usability, if you wish, that is part of the whole usability discussion. Finally in this module, I do talk, I've already talked about activism a little bit with the Masumi piece, But I've got a couple of other videos here that really try and think about how the kind of exchange, kind of digital exchange works in the real world, how online social movements emerge, things of that sort. And I think a lot of this is about understanding audiences, about giving audiences what they want, about giving audiences agency, feeling like they can actually make a difference in a kind of political or social sense. And so, I think all of that is broadly attached to this notion of interactivity. I know we often think of interactivity only as a fairly limited sort of thing. We give information to the computer gives information back to us, and those two flows of information affect each other in some way. I think it's a bigger question than that. And so I think there are some theoretical kind of models and underpinnings that attach themselves to all of this as well. So that's my quick kind of trip through the module. I hope you take a look at the videos that we have here. I think there's some really interesting stuff, and I hope in the discussion area you've got some comments from your own experience, your own areas, and kind of attempts at defining a term like interactivity. So thank you, everyone, and I will see you in the next module, and I'll see you in the discussion area.